Hey everyone! So in this video we're going to talk about operant conditioning. So both classical and operant conditioning are both types of associative learning. But the difference is that with classical conditioning you're learning the association between a neutral and an unconditioned stimulus. In operant conditioning you're learning the association between a behavior and the consequence of that behavior. Now, there are two kinds of consequences: reinforcement and punishment. Anything that increases the chances of a behavior occurring again is a reinforcement. Anything that reduces the chances of the behavior occurring again is a punishment. Now, Thorndike's law of effects suggests that any behavior that is met with a satisfying state is likely to occur again. So, when you give an organism a satisfying state after they've performed some behavior, it increases the chances of that behavior occurring again. If you provide an unsatisfying state after a behavior, it decreases the chances of that behavior occurring again. So, for example, let's say that your puppy starts whining, okay, incessantly, very high-pitched, hurts your ears, because it wants you to throw its toy. Well, if you throw the toy, okay, then the consequence of the puppy's whining is met with the satisfying consequence. Its toy has gotten thrown. So that increases the chances of that whining behavior occurring again. And because the puppy stopped whining at a very high-pitched sound, with a very high-pitched sound after you threw the toy, that's a satisfying state, which increases the chances of, in the future, when your puppy whines, it increases the chances of you throwing the toy again. I bring that particular example up because I inadvertently trained my Shih Tzu to squeal when it wants its toy thrown. It's a sad day for me, but serves as a good example for you. Anything that is a satisfying state for the organism will increase the chances of the behavior occurring again the behavior that occurred right before the satisfying consequence. So that's any kind of reinforcer. So any kind of satisfying state can be a reinforcer. Now, there are two kinds of reinforcers: positive and negative reinforcers. Now, those names get confusing, okay, because people like to assume that, well, it says positive, so it means good, or it means negative, so it must be bad. But that's not true, okay? Both positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement is a satisfying state, okay? So, for example, first of all, here's the definition. A positive reinforcement is the addition of something to the organism that wasn't already there. So let's say a kid studies hard for an exam and makes a good grade. Okay, so if that's true, and you were to, let's say, give them $20 for every A that they earned, you've added something that they didn't already have. They didn't already have that $20. So you're giving something to them. You're adding something to their current state that wasn't already there. And it's a satisfying state. So by adding something that creates a satisfying state, you've created a positive reinforcer. However, a negative reinforcer involves taking something away from their current state to create a satisfying situation. So let's say that same student studied hard for that exam and got an A. Well, rather than giving them $20, what if you took away the chores that they had already been assigned? Well, their current state before you did anything was, I have these chores. Well, when you take those chores away, you're taking something away from their current state. And less work is a satisfying state. So negative reinforcement involves taking something away to create a satisfying state for the organism. for the person or animal being taught. So both positive and negative reinforcement create a satisfying state for the person. And that point gets a little confusing for people. Punishment is any unsatisfying state which reduces the likelihood of the behavior occurring again. All right, so again, reduces. So let's say that your puppy has pooped in your front living room. Okay, you want this behavior of pooping in the living room to discontinue. All right. It smells and it leaves a stain that you got to clean up. It's bad all around. So you want to reduce this behavior. So you have to give the organism an unsatisfying state. Well, again, we have to consider what the current state of the organism is. Well, most organisms don't live in perpetual pain, which is good. But if you were to spank them, then you've added something to their current state. That means that spanking, because you're adding something to their current state that creates an unsatisfying situation. I don't know. Whereas I'm certain this is not true for everyone. For the majority of organisms, pain is an unsatisfying state. So spanking the puppy after it's pooped in your front living room is a form of positive punishment because you've added. So again, positive and negative here do not mean good and bad. I'm not saying spanking is morally good. I'm not saying that it's morally bad. I'm just saying that positive and negative, when referring to operant conditioning, when saying positive and negative when referring to operant conditioning, does not mean good and bad. Okay, so anytime you add something like pain to the current state and makes that state dissatisfying or unsatisfying, that's a positive punishment. Negative punishment involves taking something away to make an unsatisfying state. So, for example, let's say that, well, let's go back to the kid example. Let's say the kid does something you don't want him to do. So let's say start smoking. Okay, let's say that you don't want your kid to start smoking, and so to decrease the chances, you try to give them an unsatisfying state. But with negative punishment, you're taking something away. So let's say in order to decrease their smoking behavior, you take away their phone. So so their current state before you did anything was they have a phone. Well, now you're taking that phone away. So you've removed something from their current state that creates an unsatisfying state. Most kids these days, they don't seem to be very happy when they don't have their phone. So by taking the phone away, you've created an unsatisfying state. And I say kids, but I think most of us in a connected society aren't very happy when we don't have our phones. I know I'm not. So removing something to create an unsatisfying state is a negative punishment. Again, positive doesn't mean good, negative doesn't mean bad. Okay. Now, Skinner, which was one of the more famous behaviorists, behavioral psychology is the branch of psychology from which classical and operant conditioning was emerged. So they're the ones who described the processes involved. Skinner said that reinforcers are more impactful consequences than are punishers. And so when we are trying to change the behavior of a person, of an animal, anything, we tend to try and use reinforcers. So we also plan and make schedules for when an organism will be reinforced and what we're reinforcing. Okay, so we come up with what are called schedules of reinforcement. So first, we have to decide what we're reinforcing. Are we reinforcing how many times the behavior occurred, or are we reinforcing whether or not the behavior occurred at all within a given amount of time? If we're reinforcing whether or not the behavior occurred a certain number of times, that's called a ratio schedule. If we're reinforcing whether or not the behavior happened at all within a given amount of time, within a given interval of time, then it's an interval schedule. Now, we also have to determine when we're going to reinforce it. So, if we're using a ratio schedule, so we're reinforcing a behavior after a given number of times, then we can do so every fixed number of times. All right, so we're going to reinforce the behavior every fourth time it happens, in which case we have a fixed ratio schedule, or we can change it up. All right, so we can say, we'll reinforce the third time it happens first, then the sixth time, then the fourth time, then the fifth time, then the third time again, then the sixth time again, then the fifth time, then the fourth time. Now, I know that I keep changing up the numbers, but all those numbers revolve around an average number of times, specifically 4.5. So what I've done, because I've varied the number of times the behavior has to occur, I've just described to you a variable ratio schedule. Okay, so we're still reinforcing the behavior after it occurs a certain number of times, but the number of times it has to happen varies. All right, it changes. Okay. Now, the same goes for interval. So it's not the number of times the behavior occurs, it's whether or not the behavior occurs within an interval of time. So what changes is how long the interval is. Okay? So if you have a fixed interval schedule, then the interval of time, let's say a minute, okay, never changes. It's fixed. So end of the first minute, did they do the behavior? Yeah, reinforce it. Into the second minute, did they do the behavior? Yeah, reinforce it. In a third minute, in a fourth minute, in a fifth minute. All right, so the interval of time in which the behavior must occur stays the same. That's a fixed interval schedule. However, we can also vary the interval length. So let's say the first interval is a minute long. The second interval is 2 minutes long. The third interval is a half-minute long. Okay? So what happens is the size of the interval, the length of the interval, varies. Okay? But again, it's going to revolve around an average. So with variable ratio, I'm going to reinforce the behavior every time it happens on it. I'm going to reinforce the behavior on average every 4.5 times. That's a variable ratio. But the actual number of times the behavior has to occur changes if it's variable ratio. With variable interval, the length of time changes. Okay, so did it perform in the first minute? Yeah, reinforce it. Then I'm going to give them 2 minutes to do the behavior. Did it happen? Yeah, reinforce it. Now I'm going to give them 1 minute again. Did it happen? Yeah, reinforce it. Now I'm going to give them 2.5 minutes. So with variable interval, the length of the interval changes. All right, guys. I hope that's helped. Almost 15 minutes long. A bit longer than I wanted it to be, but it may have needed to be longer. So if I've left anything unexplained or unclear, please do not hesitate to send me an email and ask me clarifying questions. All right, guys. I hope this has helped. Take it easy.